船呼叫我舰。
山东舰你好，在太平洋上能遇到祖国的航母在此训练。
More than 200 Chinese vessels are now concentrated around Mischief Reef, and the speed of that buildup is what makes this development so difficult to ignore. Fewer than 40 vessels were observed there in mid-May. By May 27, the number had climbed to around 80. In early June, it passed 150, and by July 3rd, the reported count had reached 228 vessels. That is a remarkable concentration of maritime activity, but the number alone is not the most important part of the story. Mischief Reef is only about 25 miles from Second Thomas Shoal, where the Philippines maintains the BRP Sierra Madre and regularly sends resupply missions. So the question is not simply why 228 Chinese vessels are around Mischief Reef. The bigger question is what Beijing can do with such a large concentration of ships, and whether this buildup could eventually make it harder for the Philippines to operate around Second Thomas Shoal without ever requiring China to launch a direct attack. That is what makes this development worth watching. China has already shown what can happen when a disputed reef gradually becomes a permanent strategic position. Mischief Reef began as a contested maritime feature, but China established a presence there in the 1990s, consolidated control, and later transformed the reef into a major artificial island with a long runway, radar facilities, and military infrastructure. Today, it is one of China's most important positions in the Spratly Islands. And now, only about 25 miles away, sits one of the Philippines' most vulnerable outposts. 228 vessels, 25 miles, one Philippine position. That combination is what Manila has to watch. The first thing that stands out is not simply the size of the fleet, but how quickly it appeared. Fewer than 40 vessels were observed around Mischief Reef in mid-May. By May 27, there were roughly 80. In early June, the number passed 150, and by July 3, it had reached 228. That is a rapid change in the maritime picture. Now, it is important not to jump too quickly to the conclusion that every one of these vessels is part of a Chinese operation directed against the Philippines. Large fishing fleets can gather for legitimate reasons. Commercial vessels move through the region, and maritime activity naturally changes over time. The number by itself does not prove that Beijing is preparing an attack or an attempt to seize another feature. But there is another detail that has attracted attention. According to the analysis cited in the outline, more than 20 vessels were observed anchored while tied together in what analysts described as raft-like formations. That is a very different picture from fishing vessels simply spreading out across a large area. Bonji Ohara, a representative director of Deep Dive and former Japanese defense attaché in China, along with visiting fellow Miyabi Ishihara, has raised questions about whether at least some of the activity could represent coordinated maritime behavior rather than ordinary fishing operations. And that distinction matters, because once vessels begin operating in coordinated formations, the question changes from how many ships are there to what can all of those ships accomplish together. That is the part Manila needs to understand. Mischief Reef and Second Thomas Shoal are not distant locations separated by hundreds of miles of open ocean. They are only about 25 miles apart. Second Thomas Shoal is where the Philippines maintains the BRP Sierra Madre, the grounded Philippine Navy vessel that serves as a military outpost. Philippine personnel remain there, and Manila has to conduct regular rotation and resupply missions to keep the position functioning. Those resupply missions have already become some of the most dangerous encounters in the South China Sea. Philippine vessels have faced Chinese Coast Guard pressure around the shoal, including blocking maneuvers, collisions, water cannon incidents, and injuries. Both governments have accused the other of dangerous behavior while continuing to defend their competing claims. So when more than 200 Chinese vessels gather only 25 miles away, Manila has an obvious reason to pay attention. But there is an important distinction. The concentration does not prove China is preparing to attack the Sierra Madre. There is no evidence in the material provided that an imminent seizure of Second Thomas Shoal is underway. The more serious question is whether China can use a large and sustained maritime presence to make the area around the Philippine outpost increasingly difficult to operate in. That would not require an invasion. It would require pressure, And that brings us directly to the history of Mischief Reef. Mischief Reef matters because it provides a powerful example of how a disputed maritime feature can change over time. China established a presence there in the mid-1990s. Over the following years, Beijing consolidated its control, and during the 2010s, it carried out extensive land reclamation. The reef was transformed into an artificial island, eventually receiving a runway, radar and communications facilities, and other military infrastructure. That transformation is important because it did not happen in one dramatic moment. The strategic reality changed gradually. First, there was a presence. Then, the presence became regular. Then, the regular presence became difficult to challenge. Then, the physical environment itself was transformed. And eventually, a feature that had once been little more than a disputed reef became a permanent Chinese strategic position in the Spratly Islands. That history does not mean the same thing is happening at Second Thomas Shoal today. There is no evidence here that China is preparing to reclaim another reef or immediately build another artificial island. But it explains why Manila pays close attention when Chinese maritime activity changes around another disputed feature. The concern is not necessarily what happens tomorrow. It is what becomes normal over the next several years. And that is why the current concentration around Mischief Reef deserves attention. A number like 228 is naturally going to attract headlines, but the formation of the vessels may ultimately tell us more than the raw count. Again, a large fishing fleet does not automatically equal a military operation. China has an enormous fishing industry, and vessels can gather in large numbers for legitimate commercial reasons. But the reported observation of more than 20 vessels anchored while tied together in raft-like formations raises a different question about how at least some of the ships are being used. Think about the difference between a group of fishing boats scattered across the sea and a group of vessels deliberately clustered together. The first looks like ordinary maritime activity. The second can create a much more concentrated physical presence. A coordinated group can remain in an area longer, communicate with one another, create obstacles for other vessels, and make it more difficult for another country to operate freely through the same waters. That does not prove that these vessels are acting as a coordinated state force. But it is enough to make the question legitimate. Why are so many vessels concentrated at this particular location, and why are some reportedly operating in unusual formations? The answer matters because Mischief Reef is not an isolated fishing ground. It is a permanent Chinese position located close to a Philippine outpost. China's maritime strategy in the South China Sea is not based only on warships. There is a broader layer of maritime power involving fishing vessels, maritime militia, the China Coast Guard, and, behind those forces, the People's Liberation Army Navy. Each serves a different purpose. Fishing vessels can create presence. Maritime militia can support coordinated maritime activity. Coast Guard ships can conduct what Beijing describes as law enforcement operations. And naval forces provide conventional military power when required. This layered approach gives China more options than simply sending warships into disputed waters. A Chinese destroyer immediately looks like a military deployment. A large group of fishing vessels can be presented very differently. That is why gray zone competition is so difficult to respond to. The pressure can be real without looking like a traditional military attack. The objective does not necessarily have to be to start a war. It can be to gradually change the operating environment. More ships appear. Patrols become more frequent. Foreign vessels face more challenges. The other side has to spend more resources protecting its own operations. Eventually, the side applying pressure can begin to shape what the other side considers normal. That is why the 228 vessels matter. China does not necessarily need to attack Second Thomas Shoal to make Philippine control more difficult. It could make access more difficult instead. This may be the most important point in the entire story. A country does not necessarily have to physically capture an outpost to weaken another country's control over it. China maintains a large concentration around Mischief Reef. Some vessels gradually operate farther towards Second Thomas Shoal. Philippine resupply missions begin encountering more Chinese vessels. Manila responds by sending more escorts. China responds with more Coast Guard ships. The waters around the Sierra Madre become increasingly crowded. At some point, the Philippines could still have its outpost. The Philippine flag could still be flying. The government could still insist that the position remains under Philippine control. But actually reaching that position could become harder. That is the difference between having a position and having freedom of movement around that position. And that distinction is extremely important in maritime disputes. Control is not only about what a government claims, it is also about what its vessels can physically do. If Philippine ships can freely reach the Sierra Madre, Manila has much more operational freedom. If every resupply mission becomes a major confrontation, that freedom begins to shrink. And if the Chinese presence around the area becomes permanent, the balance can change without a single shot being fired. The Philippines therefore has very few easy options. If Manila sends more vessels, China can respond with greater numbers. If Manila reduces its presence, Beijing could see an opportunity to expand its own operational presence. If Philippine forces confront Chinese vessels directly, the risk of a collision or more serious incident increases. And if Manila relies mainly on diplomatic protests, the situation on the water can continue changing while diplomacy moves much more slowly. This creates a difficult strategic question. How does the Philippines defend its outpost without allowing China to determine when and how the confrontation escalates? That problem becomes even more complicated because the Philippines is not operating in isolation. The United States is a treaty ally. Japan's security relationship with Manila is expanding. The Philippine military is modernizing. And the South China Sea is increasingly connected to the wider Indo-Pacific security competition. That means another serious confrontation around Second Thomas Shoal would not remain purely local for long. But Manila also has to consider the danger of escalation. Its objective is not simply to send more ships every time China sends more ships. It has to protect the outpost while avoiding a situation where one collision, one boarding, or one miscalculation creates a much larger military crisis. That is the difficult balance. This brings us back to the 228 vessels. The most important question is no longer simply what China has built at Mischief Reef. We already know the answer. There is a roughly 1.9-mile runway, radar and communications infrastructure, and a permanent military presence. The more important question is, what can China do from there? A permanent installation gives Beijing the ability to support sustained maritime patrols, monitor activity across surrounding waters, provide logistical support for vessels operating in the region, and strengthen maritime surveillance. It also gives China a strategic position from which its Coast Guard, maritime militia, and naval forces can operate across a wider area. That is why the current vessel concentration cannot be separated from the infrastructure already sitting on the reef. The ships are not operating next to an empty piece of ocean. They are operating near an established Chinese strategic position. And approximately 25 miles away sits a Philippine outpost that China has repeatedly challenged. That does not prove that Beijing has decided to move against the Sierra Madre. But it does explain why Manila is watching the situation so closely. This is where we need to separate evidence from possibility. There is no evidence in the material provided that China is preparing an imminent seizure of Second Thomas Shoal. It would be irresponsible to turn a large vessel concentration into a prediction of an immediate attack. But there is a much more realistic concern. The conditions around the Philippine outpost could become gradually more difficult. The current concentration could eventually disappear. The ships could disperse, and the buildup could turn out to be temporary. But if a substantial number remain around Mischief Reef and Chinese activity increasingly spreads into the waters around Second Thomas Shoal, the operating environment changes. Philippine resupply missions could encounter more vessels. The cost of maintaining the outpost could rise. More escorts could become necessary. Chinese surveillance could become more persistent. And Manila could increasingly find itself operating in waters where Chinese forces have greater freedom of movement. That is the gray zone danger. It does not necessarily arrive as an invasion. It arrives through a series of smaller changes that gradually become normal. More vessels, more patrols, more pressure, more interference, and eventually less freedom for the other side. The first possibility is that the vessels disperse. If the concentration around Mischief Reef falls significantly, the current buildup may prove temporary. The underlying dispute would remain, but there would be no immediate transformation of the operational balance. That would be the least alarming outcome. The second possibility is more important. China maintains a large and persistent maritime presence. If substantial numbers remain around Mischief Reef and Chinese activity increasingly extends towards Second Thomas Shoal, Philippine resupply operations could take place under much greater pressure. That would not require a military attack. It would simply require the operating environment to become increasingly difficult. For Manila, that may be the most important near-term scenario to watch. The third possibility is much more serious. China eventually attempts to establish direct control over Second Thomas Shoal. If Beijing ever chose that path, it could theoretically involve sustained presence, increasing pressure, and eventually control, followed by infrastructure development. But this remains a scenario, not evidence of an imminent Chinese plan. The reason it matters is the precedent provided by Mischief Reef. China has already demonstrated that a disputed maritime feature can move from contested space to permanent strategic infrastructure over time. The number 228 is dramatic, but the figure that may ultimately matter even more is 25 miles. That is approximately the distance between Mischief Reef and Second Thomas Shoal. 25 miles means that what happens around one feature cannot easily be separated from what happens around the other. Mischief Reef gives China a permanent strategic position. Second Thomas Shoal gives the Philippines one of its most important positions in the Spratly Islands. And between them is a relatively short stretch of water. So if the Chinese concentration remains large, Manila will naturally watch for signs that vessels are moving closer to Second Thomas Shoal. Will the ships stay around Mischief Reef? Will they spread into surrounding waters? Will more Coast Guard vessels appear near the Philippine outpost? Will resupply missions face greater pressure? Will Manila increase its own presence? And if both sides continue adding vessels, how long can they operate so close together without another serious confrontation? Those are the questions that matter now. The easiest mistake would be to focus entirely on the headline number. 228 ships sounds dramatic. But the pattern is more important. Mischief Reef provides the precedent. The 228 vessels provide the current warning. The 25-mile distance provides the connection. Second Thomas Shoal provides the potential flashpoint. And the reported raft-like formations provide the reason analysts are asking whether at least some of the activity is more coordinated than ordinary fishing. Put those pieces together and the concern becomes clearer. The biggest danger may not be a sudden Chinese attack on the Sierra Madre. It could be something much slower. China could maintain more vessels, increase patrols, expand surveillance, put greater pressure on Philippine missions, make every resupply operation more complicated, and gradually create an environment where Philippine control remains intact on paper but becomes increasingly difficult to exercise freely. That is how gray zone pressure can work. There may never be one dramatic moment when everyone agrees that control has changed. Instead, the situation changes one encounter at a time, one patrol at a time, one obstruction at a time, until eventually the maritime reality looks very different from where it started. China has already shown what it can do with Mischief Reef. The reef went from a contested maritime feature to a permanent Chinese strategic position with a runway, radar facilities, and military infrastructure. Now more than 200 Chinese vessels are concentrated around it, with the reported number reaching 228 by July 3. And only about 25 miles away is Second Thomas Shoal, where the Philippines continues to maintain the BRP Sierra Madre and conduct regular resupply missions. None of this proves that China is preparing to seize Second Thomas Shoal, but it creates a warning Manila cannot afford to ignore. Because if the next stage is simply more Chinese vessels, more patrols, and more pressure, The Philippines will face the same difficult question every time it sends a mission toward the Sierra Madre. How much pressure can Manila absorb before maintaining the outpost becomes more difficult than challenging the pressure? That is the calculation Beijing may be trying to force Manila to make. And that is why the 228 vessels matter. Not because 228 ships automatically mean war. They do not. They matter because they could represent another step in a much slower competition over who can actually operate in the waters surrounding the Philippines' most vulnerable positions. China has already shown what can happen when a disputed reef becomes a permanent outpost. The question now is whether the waters around Second Thomas Shoal are becoming the next test of that strategy.